Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books author reading series. If you'd like to learn more about us and our many upcoming author events, please visit skylightbooks.com, where you can browse our inventory, buy books, and join our Friends with Benefits Club. You can also follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook. To speak to a real live bookseller like me, please call 323-660-1175. Thanks for your support, and enjoy.
We should probably dim the lights for this.
I think we should.
For this particular discussion.
We decided that we're not going to use the word we're not going to use any words like hard, penetrate. What else did we agree on?
I forgot that conversation. I'm all embarrassed because I know nothing about what we're talking about. So this is all just academic from my standpoint. So Alex and Cruising got a wonderful review today in the San Francisco Chronicle, which is very exciting. Mm-hmm. And before we read a little something, or before you read a little something, I was wanting to first get a sense of how this came about. I learned at dinner that your publisher came to you with a proposal, and then it sort of took on a life of its own. And maybe talk a little bit about how it's this interesting mixture of memoir and history and sort of socio-political commentary.
Thanks everyone for being here too. I know it's a Friday at 7:30 in LA, so a lot of you had to fight traffic to get here, and I really appreciate it. And there's a lot of friends in the audience, a lot of people that I know and love, and always reading at Skylight. It's always been such a wonderful experience. So
and there's some seats down the front if anyone.
There are seats. Don't be afraid. Nobody bites unless you want them to. I was writing this novel actually about a family of Mexican wrestlers, Mexican luchadores, and one of the characters in the book is a college student, and he's having a hard time making ends meet, and he resorts to having to solicit for sex, for money. And I was dealing sort of in the realm of cruising and hooking up when around the time Unnamed, my press, put out a great book called Arcade. Right. And I read it and I reviewed it for the Los Angeles Review of Books, and I really loved it. And that sort of started this conversation with Olivia and Chris about the possibility of maybe doing something like this. And they sort of asked me, like, have you ever thought about, writing some of this? And I thought, no, because I'm too chicken. That's why I write fiction, because it's easy to sort of to say, well, it wasn't me, it was my characters. And so Olivia and Chris were kind of giving me permission, I think, in a lot of ways to write, to take a look at this and encouraged me to write about my own experiences. And so it kind of was a happy accident. And, it sort of evolved into this long conversation about this practice as a political act, for the gay community to sort of resist and revolutionize, and that's kind of how it evolved. And
So has it been kind of scary because it is, in many ways, there's some intimate, personal stories in there that are melded with the bigger picture political stuff and the history of cruising, which is really interesting. I mean, we go from Greece to Griffith Park to Grindr in a way. And can you talk a little bit about that sort of trajectory and how you chose to tackle it from all these different perspectives?
Well, I think I met my partner. He doesn't like me to call him. What am I supposed to call you, Kyle, again? Not husband.
Your not husband.
My not husband. Actually, online. I met him online back in 2000, and it was on gay.com. Yeah, okay. So yeah, you remember gay.com, right? Yeah. That's like old school,
So
right?
quaint.
Yeah, it was really quaint. And that was like back when, like, you didn't tell anyone that you met someone online. And so my whole experience, with sort of this culture of hooking up and has always been sort of looking at it from not just the past, but also from a sort of more technical current sort of culture.
I love the idea of the technical aspects of hooking up.
Yeah.
I mean, because the sort of transformation from being out in the world, accomplishing that, and then this whole digital thing is really an amazing, in our lifetime. I mean, it's changed the whole nature of that for a generation.
It has.
And yet traditional cruising still continues.
It still continues. But I think we have a generation now that's sort of looking at it more as, it's kind of like Uber. You know what I mean? Like Uber or Lyft.
Like fast and available?
Yeah, it's just sort of like, it's convenient, right?
Uh-huh. Like you don't have to leave, you can order in, you don't have to leave the house?
Well, you have to leave your house, but it's just like, you
Not
can sort of
necessarily.
orchestrate it, right? Like, I'll be here at this time, right?
Or I'll leave the door open.
I'll leave the door open.
Yeah. Anyway, we're digressing.
Are we?
I don't know. Maybe you could read that opening.
Do you want? Okay.
Opening sweep would be a good start before we go down the hill entirely immediately.
Okay. So I'm gonna read the prelude. You have to practice patience when you cruise. You need to be alone for long stretches, often looking for something that isn't always there. It takes time to cultivate this skill. It takes time to learn how to identify the cracks, to see the openings, to recognize the breaks and tears that exist in the ordinary. It's meditative. The driving around and around in circles past the same spot, the watching, the waiting. It teaches you how to be still in the moment, how to feel Earth spinning on its axis, how to sense the gravitational pull of the ground beneath your feet. In those moments of feeling and being anonymous, fleeting as they were, I learned about patience and perseverance. It reminds me a lot of writing. Both require a level of isolation, of quiet solitude. Both ask to reach deep inside, to look inward, to sit with your memories and thoughts while everything hurls forward and you wonder, what is the pursuit all about? What will be revealed at the end? How will the color of things change when one comes out of the journey? It's a moment that captures something unnameable, but it feels crucial for survival. It's an impulse so strong that it boils the blood. It alters time and reality and sense. And the only way you get better at it, at both, is by returning to it, by doing it over and over again and again. Cruising taught me how to cultivate a sense of confidence. I learned how to walk a little more slowly in the world. I learned how to watch and wait for the revelations, for the climax, if you will, to come. Cruising made me right.
Thank you. And I'm fascinated by that statement, cruising made me right. And I'm wondering if you could reveal some more about that nexus between the experience of cruising and your discovering writing.
I grew up in a house. I'm the youngest of 11. Yeah, I know. It's a lot. I'm the youngest. And I didn't have my own bedroom. So my bedroom was the living room. I slept out on the couch. And a lot of my growing up, I didn't have my own space. I didn't have a place to sort of call and claim as my own. And so in a lot of ways, I think I turned to literature and writing because it provided me an opportunity to escape, right? It gave me an opportunity to sort of, exist in another world, away from, my crazy family and a lot of the drama that was going on there. And I think in a lot of ways, the experiences that I had you know, going out, cruising, meeting men, sort of identifying and finding those sort of cracks in society that, you know, you have to slip into and out of, was kind of the same thing, right? That solitude, you know, sort of finding that subculture and sort of being able to slip into it and out of it whenever I wanted. I think there was power in that for me. And it gave me an opportunity, I think, to understand my place within the larger world a little better, right? Because, I mean, I wasn't the most confident person. I mean, I grew up with a disability, and I grew up poor and Mexican, and there was a lot of strikes against me, right? And so, you know, here was an opportunity for me to get attention.
So
right?
in that environment, there was a kind of currency that you carried with you. And so it seems as though your early experiences were kind of positive, which I think isn't perhaps everyone's early experience in those environments. And can you talk about how that early good experience, and maybe in a minute we can read that little scene where you talk about that. Just set that up for us a little bit and tell us about how the positive nature of that experience sort of set you on a trajectory of embracing that world and embracing yourself in a way that you might not otherwise
Well,
have.
I mean, that came at a time when I was feeling really, really, really terrible about myself.
How old were you?
I was 16, and you know, it was a pretty bad time. I mean, I was physically, you know, I was dealing with my hair loss, my alopecia, which is kind of funny because on Vermont and Sunset, that big Kaiser building that's on the corner, that was my dermatologist's office. And I remember as a kid sitting up on the very top floor and looking out and seeing, I used to always love to look out the window. And I used to look out and see Griffith Observatory all the time. So every time I drive up here, that's the first thing I think about. But, you know, I mean, that was a really bad time.
Is it alopecia? There are different. You have totalis or universalis?
Universalis.
The whole shebang.
The whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that was a particularly dark time, I think, a difficult time for me. I was in high school. I wasn't doing so well.
And you were in La Puente still?
Yeah, I was in the San Gabriel Valley, living with my family, and it was my first time. I had a job, my first job. I was working retail. I worked at the mall, and you know, I just happened to be sitting on a bus, you know, at the bus, waiting for the bus to get my paycheck, and this guy drove up.
Do you want to read that? Do you want to read that scene?
Okay, I'll read this section. So yeah, I think that's really much all you need to know about this section. I'm not going to reveal what happens after, right? But I think y'all know, right? I was 15 and sitting on a bus stop on my way to the mall to pick up my paycheck. I worked at a retail store that sold novelty gifts, greeting cards, stuffed animals, bags of potpourri, and large ceramic masks of jesters and crying clowns that people bought to hang on their walls. That particular summer was especially hot, even for the San Gabriel Valley. I was in shorts and high tops, and despite the heat, I also wore a thick gray sweatshirt and a flimsy baseball cap. I always wore long sleeves and hats back then. These were part of my armor, how I deflected attention from the imperfections I was born with, a birth defect that had stunted the development of my right arm, and the growing bald patches across my scalp from alopecia that left tan spots shaped like small continents on my head. There was a portable cassette player clipped to the elastic band of my shorts, and I was too busy rewinding the tape to the beginning of The Boy with the Thorn in His Side. It was the 80s. To see the white, and not in a sort of I sort of ironic kind of way, 80s, but like the actual 80s. There was a white Hyundai Excel, hatchback, pulling up to the curb a few feet away from where I sat. I noticed it the second time, though, because the driver got out, walked around, and pretended to inspect the back tire. He wore bright teal shorts, Reeboks, and a tight black muscle shirt. His hair was dark brown and long, glistening with mousse and hairspray that I could smell from my place on the bench. On the third drive-by, he stopped again, reached across the passenger seat, and rolled down the window. "Do you want a lift?" he asked. I don't mean this to sound overly simplistic, but I came of age during a weird time in American history. I guess everyone thinks that, though. I've often said that the 1980s were particularly challenging for a closeted Mexican kid with a disability. The decade saw the rise of the new right, of Reaganomics and tax cuts for the wealthy, and of a culture that rewarded success and greed, which led to a decade of excess, extravagance, yuppies, individualism, increased isolation, xenophobia, and a rise in cocaine use. It was an era of too much, of straight edges and crisp lines, of big shoulder pads and nail prints with geometric shapes. The zeitgeist failed to consider the way in which want is tied to balance of perfection, the value we place on symmetry and excess in relation to desire. My flaws and my imperfections stood out, even in my working class environment where people struggled to make ends meet, where fathers worked in cavernous factories around deadly solvents and dangerous machines that could crush legs and sever arms. Even greater threats like famine, disease, and nuclear annihilation from the Soviet Union loomed on the horizon. And in the midst of this schizophrenic time, when we craved stability, as the world around us seemed to be inching toward apocalyptic destruction, I had my first sexual encounter and was introduced to a secret world.
Thank you.
So, if you want to know what happened after, you have to buy the book. I'm just kidding.
It's interesting to me how, at some level, that was an important and positive experience.
Yeah.
And yet there's the other part of me that thinks about you're 16 years old and you're being picked up by an older man. And so there's this double-edged sword about cruising as being an empowering, radical pastime, and also being something that can lead you down the not necessarily the most positive path. So it depends, I think, very much on the individual experience. And it's fascinating that you had that experience. And can you talk a little bit about that currency, like what you experienced being that kid, and the power you felt in that world as you explored it more, compared with the disempowerment you felt in your regular world?
I think it was all sort of corporeal, right? Like I could become someone else in those spaces because nobody cared whether I was disabled or whether I was Mexican or poor. The transaction that sort of happens at that moment, I think is, was worth something for me. It sort of taught me a little bit about my own limits and my capabilities.
Were you aware of trading in your youth? Not trading in, but trading. I mean, that your youth was another kind of currency at that time?
No. No. I always felt really bad. I guess everybody kind of does, right? Feel sort of
like bad in a negative way, or
like,
bad as a Michael Jackson.
Both. I grew up Catholic and made to feel really bad about like any kind of sexual desire, right? Like we didn't talk about that, and in my family, like we had a really difficult time sort of negotiating, what sexuality is and was, and so, I grew up with this really fucked up idea of what it was to be a male and what it was to be, sexual, and my family was very, very, very anti-gay, and I had to hide a lot of it, and I not only was I sort of in the closet for that, but I was also in the closet, because of my disability, right? I was hiding that. And I think in the cruising spaces, when I had those opportunities and those interactions, there was no hiding. I could be who I wanted to be. And there was a kind of, it was refreshing. Right. It was empowering, and it made me feel good because it didn't matter to them, who I was. What mattered to them was the exchange, that moment, right?
It reminds me of the John Ritchie quote you use in the
Yeah.
opening. The promiscuous homosexual is a sexual revolutionary. Each moment of his outlaw existence, he confronts repressive laws, repressive morality, parks, alleys, subway tunnels, garages, streets. These are the battlefields. And I'm wondering also, did you share those early experiences with anyone, or did you carry that secret life sort of created a world of its own?
I carried it. Like, I didn't share it with anyone. You know, I mean, one of the things that we used to do when I was growing up, and you know, when I finished high school, was, you know, we in the San Gabriel Valley, like everybody, we would all pile up into cars and go to West Hollywood, right? Like that was the thing that you did if you were Latino and you were gay and you were in the closet. Like you went to West Hollywood, and I talk a little bit about this in the book. Is that, you know, I was always like the one that of all my friends, I was the one that was never like, you know, hit on or picked up, right? Because of my disability, and so I was always really shy and really awkward in those spaces, and it made me feel uncomfortable. I felt very insecure. It sort of heightened that insecurity, and when I discovered these other spaces, I kind of felt like it was a secret that I wanted to keep to myself, right? Like I didn't want to share it with anyone.
In Cruising, Alex explores these personal stories, and as you're speaking, I always feel this when I'm with you, this vulnerability and intensity, and I'm always very touched by you. So I really appreciate that part of what you've written. But then you also explore the history of cruising throughout the ages. And can you talk a little bit about the researching of that and some particular things you learned about that? For example, I learned that there were early AIDS likelihoods in the 1920s in the Congo. Stuff like that. There's a lot of that in the book that I didn't know about and really appreciated learning. Anyway, just if you'd like, go with that.
I'm sure, I mean, for you, it's the same thing when you write fiction, right? You know, the research is sort of what we have fun with, right? And, you know, it was spending a lot of time sort of looking at the history from antiquity until now, you know, following leads. I couldn't have done it without, Hannah's here, my research assistant. Hannah, hey Hannah. Hannah was my wonderful research assistant.
Where did you find her?
Olivia found her. Woo! It was kind of weird though, because like I'd never had a research assistant, so I really didn't know what to have Hannah look for.
I think I've seen her in Griffith Park.
Have you really? I didn't know what to tell Hannah to look for, right? So it was kind of weird, but we kind of got over it, right? We figured it out. You know, for me, it was really fascinating, and I think one of the things that the research really was able to unearth was, despite so much, you know, so many laws, so many, so much, you know, so many edicts, and that the practice of cruising has continued, right? It's survived decade after decade, which was really empowering and really wonderful. And I think one of the things that I always tell people to do with this book is to sort of look beyond the idea of it just being about sex, right? There's a lot of sex in the book, but I think it's also about a community finding an opportunity to create the space despite so much legislation aimed at stamping out that community, right?
Because in places, and you talk about, where is it in Africa? Uganda, where it's so repressive that those spaces are the only places that people sometimes can congregate, or not even congregate, but sort of pass in these weird cruisy environments. Can you tell us a little about the Uganda
I had
guy you spoke with?
I had an opportunity to talk to a gay rights activist in Uganda, who was a good friend of David Kato, who was like considered by many the first openly gay man in Uganda. And as everybody knows, Uganda has one of the most, like, it's one of the most repressive places to be gay. It's really difficult. It's dangerous. I think it was voted like the most dangerous place in the world to be gay. And this guy Dennis, I just reached out to him on Facebook, and I said, "Hey, I'm writing this book about cruising, and I just want to know what it's like to be gay and to hook up in Uganda." And he said, "Well, give me a call." And I called him, and we talked, and I said, "So how do you do it? Like, how do you do it in Uganda?" And he said, "Well, you have to have a really tight-knit group of friends, and the only people that you can be intimate with are the individuals in that group." And so it sort of shed light on this idea of how the culture of cruising can create community, right? And that these individuals have to be so closely connected to each other.
Because in Uganda, I mean, the act of sodomy is punishable by death.
By death, yeah.
And we forget living here how many countries in the world are like that. And, we're swanning around
Right.
Doing whatever.
Right.
And, it can be tough enough here maybe for those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s. But we forget what our freedoms bring here. And, and I think the gay community here often forgets about what's going on in other parts of the world. You also looked at Russia.
I did. I looked at Russia, and I looked at. I talked to an artist actually who photographs a lot of gay cruising sites in Russia, and there they call them plashkas, and they're usually located near monuments of like old Soviet leaders, like Lenin, and and it's not like some political thing like we're gonna like fuck in front of the statue of Lenin, right? Like it's more because they're centrally located in parks, right? And so and then they're near trains, so you can take a train, get off, and then get back on the train and leave without anybody noticing you, right? And so, I had an extended conversation with him about what led you to sort of put these two together? And I also had a great conversation with my friend Danny Haudegi, who is an artist at Whittier College who looks at, he used the Damron address book, right? Which was like
Can you talk a little bit about that?
The address book was like the Grindr before Grindr, I guess. It was like a little book that was tiny enough to fit in your back pocket, right? And it listed all of the gay hotspots across the country. And so you can go, and if you were in Arizona, you could find a bar. It was a gay-friendly bar, and usually it had codes that told you what was available there. And so my friend Danny looked at, his art charts the trajectory of the openings and closures of a lot of the gay bathhouses in LA during the AIDS crisis, right? And so...
so there were how many that went to how many?
I don't know.
Oh, you write it. You have it in the book. It's like
Do I?
there were so many. And where's your research assistant?
I don't know, Hannah.
There were like loads, and then there was suddenly just
there was
a
suddenly
handful.
nothing. Yeah, there was suddenly a handful. And his research, his sort of impetus for starting that project was because he was living in Silver Lake with his partner, and this was during the Prop 8, drama, and one of the headquarters for anti-Prop 8, so the good guys, was in Silver Lake, and it was in a former bathhouse, right? And so he found out that it was a former bathhouse, and sort of that was what sort of fueled him to do this project where he sort of does this digital map of the opening and the closings of all of these bathhouses. And so I think, I talked to a lot of individuals who were finding ways to sort of give these ephemeral places permanence, right? And through that permanence, they gain a sense of legitimacy. And there was the curious case of the Mansfield, Ohio Police Department situation also, right? And this was in the 60s. I don't know if anybody knows, how many of you know about this, but in the 60s, there was a bathroom in Mansfield, Ohio, in the Mansfield Central Park, where the police caught wind of the fact that there were men engaging in sexual activity, and they installed a two-way hidden camera to record all of these experiences that these men were having.
The comings and goings.
The comings and goings, if you will. And then this artist was doing research on it, found the actual reel, and repurposed it for an art exhibition. And everybody got really upset because, it sort of was calling into question the responsibility of art and whether it's okay to exploit these people. So I reached out to the people that he was working with, and I asked, well, where's this film being screened? Or and they actually sent me a link to it, right? And so I watched it, the whole thing, one night, and it's really fascinating and disturbing, and because you see a cross-section of men. It's old men, young men, white men, black men, overweight, working class, men in suits, all of them engaging in these very, very private activities, and it's all being recorded, right? So that kind of shook me a little bit. And it sort of was leading into this whole idea of surveillance, right? Because the apps and a lot of the like websites like Grindr and are really calling into question, I think,
because governments in places like Saudi
India,
Arabia and India are
Pakistan,
overseeing that. And
yeah, so it was the research kind of led me down a bunch of really interesting leads, and I think the difficult thing is always trying to pare it down and like what story are you trying to tell, right? Because there was a lot of ways that I could have gone.
But you do encompass a nice diversity of approaches to the topic. Can you talk a little bit about cruising as a political act? I mean, you touched on this, but in the book you explore that in various ways. Is there something you'd like to add about the politics of cruising, or the sort of the revolutionary, subversive nature of that, and whether it sustains that in this day and age? I mean, Grindr doesn't seem very subversive particularly, but maybe it is in its way. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because I was talking to a sort of younger generation, and in doing research, and I'd ask do you cruise? And a lot of the younger gay people I talked to were like, what is that? They don't even use that word anymore. And so it was kind of this really weird disconnect. But I mean, I do think it's still happening, whether it's political in the same sense that we know, that's up for debate. But I think it is still happening. It is still occurring. But whether this new generation sees it as political or not is another story, right? I think that I see it as a way in which I think our community has resisted a lot of the sort of larger and dominant ideologies that have been enforced on us, right? How we can, like someone like George Michael, right, was basically like, well, fuck you. Like, yeah, I was arrested in a bathroom, and so what? And then he wrote a song about it, right?
As opposed to the old senator who was...
Yeah, Larry Craig.
Of the wide stance.
Right, the wide stance and the tapping foot, right? So, I think I'd like, I like to see it as something revolutionary in the sense that it's existed for a long time, and it still exists. And the more, my research has shown that the more you try to sort of regulate it and control it, the more fire you give it, right? And just like any revolutionary act, I think.
Yeah. I think of Larry Craig, and I think of those straight men who are in those environments, who are so repressed and so lonely and desperate, is not a liberated state.
Yeah.
You know, and so there is the loneliness and the fear that permeates a lot of those experiences and environments. So for some, it's not a liberating time.
Right.
And there are ramifications, obviously, around disease and arrest. So that this is this overarching fear that creates an intensity. And we talked little bit about this before. And that kind of intensity sometimes is hard to recreate in a regular relationship.
Yeah.
And so there's that desire to return and create that adrenaline, whatever that chemical change is that happens in that heightened state.
Right. And I think it's, a lot of because I interviewed a lot of men who, had engaged in it in various degrees. And yeah, for a lot of the men that I talked to, there was that sense of guilt, that sense of shame. And a lot of times it was tied to religion. It was like, well, I was raised, fundamentalist this or, super religious that. And I always felt really bad. I felt like, something really horrible was going to happen to me. So it was always sort of in one way or another tied to religion or family, right? It's interesting that despite a lot of time having passed for them and those experiences, they still remembered them so clearly. They could tell me the color of like the tiles in the bathroom, right? They could remember the smells of things. They could remember. So there's they still hold on to a certain level of intimacy. That sort of sensory, heightened sensory perception is tied to a certain level of intimacy for them, right?
And the question for me always is are those anonymous encounters, I guess there's kind of a sexual intimacy, but it seems to me to be not necessarily a true intimacy. Because you say somewhere, like, we go out to get fucked, but what we want is love, or you say something to that effect. And I feel like that's often the bottom line. It's this sort of misdirection.
Yeah, I mean, I think it
I mean, I don't want to be a downer.
No. I think it can. I think it can be for some, right? But I think also for others, it's an opportunity to sort of revel in what it
in a kind of freedom.
Yeah, in a kind of freedom, because you have to think a little bit about, Stonewall happened, and then you had the 70s, and it was like, no holds barred. I mean, everyone was out having sex and having fun. And then shortly thereafter, you had AIDS, right? So a lot of that culture, I think, was sort of, that lifestyle was kind of dampened because of that. And I think that for a lot of men, that fear kind of pulled them away from it, right? A lot of, the men I talked to, decided that they were going to remain celibate rather than risk, catching something.
And also there are possibilities in cruising for non-physical connection, but getting the job done, which to many people I think felt safer during that era than something more truly intimate.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
On that note, I think we've gone on for a while.
Have we gone on for a while?
I have no idea. I haven't even asked half the questions I wanted to, but let's now open it up for any questions. If anyone has a question to formulate or formulated, please ask it as a question.
Hi. You said that you had a little difficulty switching from fiction to nonfiction. What did you find that was connected between those two, that was not difficult, that felt natural between both?
Did everyone hear that? Look, I think so.
Yeah. Storytelling, right? It's all about, I think, whether you're writing a novel or whether you're writing a piece of nonfiction, what's important is the way in which you're telling the story, right? How you assemble it, what you want to say. I think that's universal, right? I don't know about poetry because I don't write poetry.
But you write very poetically.
Hey, what does that even mean?
I don't know.
When
but
people say
it
that.
always sounds good.
You write poetically. Does anybody say you write prosaically, David? No.
No.
Right?
Any other questions?
Some of my best friends are poets, so I'm not going to.
One of the things that always has fascinated me about cruising is the way that it transforms your understanding of public space.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about kind of the, I guess like the architecture of cruising, or how it changed the way that you inhabited certain public spaces that had suddenly this dual nature to them?
You know, I looked at Aaron Betsky, who is an architect and has written a lot about public spaces and architecture and the queering of public spaces, right? And so one of the things he says about cruising spaces is that they have to be, the bathroom or the place that it exists in has to be in some way or the other sort of difficult to get to, right? Like it can't be a place that's like traversed by a lot of people, right? So there has to be a sort of, like you have to go out and seek it and find it, right? And so I thought that was interesting, right? When I looked at some of the different locations and was able to sort of analyze like where their position is, you know, in the store, right? In the Macy's, right? Macy's is big. So next time you're in Macy's.
For those of you who've come for some hints.
Yeah. So it's, you know, the bathroom always has to be kind of away, right? It's usually like in the customer service section where you have to turn left or buy the women's shoes, right? Or the discount area, right? So there has to be some sort of inability for individuals by like the larger community to get to it, to access
It's so
it.
weird that the men's bathroom's always by the women's shoes.
Isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm thinking you explore Recchi and Edmund White, but then there's also that seminal book about
Tea Room?
cruising called Tea Room Trade.
Oh, God. Yeah, Lord Humphreys.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, God, where do you want me to start?
I don't know, but I mean, no one's ever heard of Tea Room Trade except of
Has
course.
anybody heard of Tea Room Trade? Okay,
Oh my
yeah,
God,
see, I
look,
got lots of people
everyone.
in here. You talk about it in class, right, Beth? Yeah. It's a really, I don't even know where to start. Like, it's this sort of comprehensive look at, told in a very dry, very anthropological way about, like, what cruising is, like what men do. There's like a description of like a glory hole. There's like a hole where a man sticks his penis through. You know, it's very clinical. But also he was, you know,
His name was Lord Humphreys.
Lord Humphreys.
Laud.
Yeah. And he got in a lot of trouble because of the way in which he went about, you know, getting some of his information and research. Is he didn't tell a lot of the people. You know, that he was doing what he was doing. Sometimes he pretended to be, I don't remember what they called it, but like, he was like the lookout, right? Like when two guys would hook up in a bathroom, he'd be like, I think they called it like lookout queen or something stupid like that. So he'd be like looking and make sure that nobody walks in, right? So he was undercover, but he wasn't telling these individuals what he was doing. So it's told in a very dry, a very clinical way that is
so weird and interesting.
yeah.
How, coming from where you came from as a young boy, how did you find the news and the information and the literature and the book?
Oh, I didn't have any of that. It found me. It found me, and then once it found me, it was kind of weird. It was like this honing beacon that went off. Like suddenly, it was like when I had that encounter, it was like suddenly there were all these other guys who were like, "Hey, like, come here," and I didn't. You know, I think I gave off a scent after that. Right? It was like some pheromone or something that suddenly guys were like, "Oh shit!" Like. Go get them, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, sure, let's do it. But I didn't really have. No, it found me. I didn't have to. I had a pen pal in England who was gay, right? And I think that like that was kind of that was the one moment when I sort of tried to find it, right? But he was in England. And that was like really far. But like we would write letters like, what do you look like? What are you wearing? You know, and it was kind of stupid. And then my sisters would like, why are you getting letters from a guy in England? So I'm like, I don't know, because I like Morrissey. But, you know, I mean, we didn't really have any way to sort of, it just sort of found me, you know?
And then once the sort of the green light gets turned on, the sort of that homing instinct.
Then you know where to start looking
over.
for it, right?
I mean, I have no idea myself. Any other questions?
Notice how he sort of, see how he did that? Like, any other questions, anyone?
Alex, what about your siblings? You had 10 siblings, didn't you?
Uh-huh.
Are any of them gay, and did any of them...
No. I'm the only one, at least that I know of.
But none of them you weren't open with any of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think they know, right? But growing up, it wasn't like, hey, I'm gay, just so you know, like it just sort of happened, right? Like they're like, well, of course you're gay, like you're like Madonna, right? Like, but yeah, it just sort of happened.
And yet there's that Catholic veil over the family.
Yeah, but a lot of families have that, don't they?
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
We have a lot of questions. Who do we go to, David? Oh shit.
I appreciated just kind of like talking about your family. I like that part about how you learned about cruising through the boulevard in the cars with your.
My brothers, yeah.
And I also appreciated how you talk about LA as a cruising space. A lot of the cruising narratives are about New York or
Yeah.
other cities. My question for you is actually, cruising is always kind of talked about as a gay male thing. Do you think queer women cruise?
Hannah, we talked about this, didn't we? Like, maybe Hannah can talk a little more about this better, because she's the one that did the research on that. Right? There's like different approaches, right, to the way in which women cruise, and it's not as anonymous usually as it is in the spaces with men. But it does happen. It's just kind of a different. I think it happens in a different way in different spaces, right? But it's really usually not anonymous in the way in which you and I think about anonymity, right? There's no understall things going on usually with women.
There's a famous Australian swimmer who won a gold medal, whose name is escaping me, who actually did meet her life partner in a restroom.
Oh, really? Wow.
I know. But I think that's unusual. I think it's usually at brunch.
Yeah.
And yes.
So it's kind of two questions under one umbrella of like class. So I was wondering if the class distinction was mostly in America, or if it like transcended to different countries for cruising. I was curious also, has that gone away? Has that gotten more prevalent? How has that like transitioned throughout history?
I think it's always been. It's always been governed by certain rules and roles, right? Even if you look at ancient Greece and Rome, there were certain individuals who were allowed to own slaves, right? And there was the whole passive versus active role, right? The penetrator versus the penetratee or whatever. So there's always been this sort of foundation of roles. In terms of the sort of the socioeconomic labels, a lot of that, because my research was focused specifically on the U.S., I sort of looked at a lot of that in the U.S., but there was some of that in the U.K., like with cottaging. Especially when you look at the Molly houses, right, in the 18th and 19th century, a lot of those individuals were every strata of the sort of social ladder, and so it does have, I think, its roots in this ability to sort of even out, I think, a lot of the the playing field in terms of economics and in terms of who's represented and the roles in which they play. But there are still roles. It's important to remember that there are still definitive sort of parameters that you need to exist within and operate within in order for it to continue.
But even in your early experiences that you share in the book, there is sort of a transcending of class.
Yeah.
In the cruising space in the modern age.
Yeah.
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 Any other questions? Just the last one.
Okay, so we've talked a bit here about space and spaces of cruising, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about time. To what extent do you think these spaces of cruising are transhistorical or change through time? Do you see this as like a kind of transhistorical experience?
Like, what do you mean by transhistorical?
Well, like you talk about the spaces, right?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily. You didn't find like bathrooms where where men would hook up, right? There were bath houses, right? But there weren't specific locations very much. I think you start to see a lot more of that with the formation and the advent of cities, right? And city squares and places where people congregate, right? Like in France, in the UK, once cities start developing, I think certain spaces are created that proliferate and allow for these encounters to happen. It's interesting to note that with all of the changes that we're seeing in cities like LA and San Francisco, that a lot of the cruising spaces are being, you're starting to see them vanish because of gentrification, right? So suddenly you have these restrooms in parks where, families didn't live before, right? And suddenly families are starting to move in and the park becomes a different space and that bathroom no longer is, doesn't allow for that kind of interaction to happen, right? So you're starting to see some of it change a little bit. But, those spaces still exist. I think as long as there are people and as long as there are cities, there'll be places.
There'll be cruising.
Yeah.
Alex, just before we close up, where did you meet your non-husband?
Online, on gay.com.
Oh, online, so modern.
Yeah, so modern, back in 2001.
I met my future husband at the Century City Mall on the stairway.
Really?
Mm-hmm. I did. On that note, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Alex. And go out and
David.
Buy this book. Alex will be signing them momentarily, and we'll chat to you with any further questions. And thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.